The throne room had not pulsed in 400 years. Isadora Voss felt it. The moment her fingers grazed the armrest, a deep, resonant thrum that moved up through her palm, through her wrist, through the marrow of her bones, as though the ancient obsidian chair recognized something in her that she did not yet recognize in herself. The stone beneath her touch glowed amber, then white, then a color that had no name in any human language, and every vampire in the hall fell utterly silent. She yanked her hand back, too late. Every eye in the Court of Noctura was on her. 30 vampires in tailored black, ancient eyes burning from pale aristocratic faces, all of them frozen mid-conversation, mid-drink, mid-breath they did not even need. The silence was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind that preceded executions. "Step away from the throne." The voice came from across the hall, low and deliberate and absolutely certain of its own authority. Marius Dragomir descended the black marble steps 2 at a time, his white hair pulled back from a face that was all sharp lanes and controlled fury, silver eyes locked on Isadora, with an intensity that made her chest constrict. He wore no crown tonight, but he did not need one. The way the other vampires parted around him said everything. He was the Lord of Noctura. He was the most dangerous thing in the room, and he was looking at her like he could not decide whether to shield her or condemn her. "I was dusting it," Isadora said. Her voice was steady, which impressed even herself. The feather duster in her left hand was a small but committed detail. "I did not mean to touch it. I stumbled." "You stumbled?" He stopped 3 feet from her. Up close, Marius Dragomir was even more unnerving. 6 feet and 3 inches of coiled, immortal precision, white skin nearly luminous in the candlelight. Those silver eyes cataloguing her, like she was a puzzle he was not certain he wanted to solve. "And the Silence Throne responded to your touch." "I do not know what the Silence Throne is." "No," he said quietly. "You would not." From behind him, a voice cut through the tension like glass breaking on stone. "She needs to be removed, Marius. Blood law is clear. No human is permitted to activate a sovereign artifact." The speaker was a vampire named Kylindra, tall and white-haired, and wearing a silk gown the color of dried roses, her expression a sculptured mask of aristocratic disapproval. She was, Isadora had learned in her 3 months of service to the court, one of the most powerful nobles in Noctura and one of the most quietly dangerous. "The girl must be detained, questioned, and if the questioning reveals what I suspect it reveals, she must be dealt with accordingly." "The girl," Marius said, still not taking his eyes off Isadora, "has a name, and she is under my protection." The phrase landed in the room with an almost audible weight. Isadora watched several vampires exchange glances. Even Kylindra's composure flickered just once before it sealed back into porcelain perfection. "Your protection," Kylindra repeated carefully, "is not a shield against blood law, my lord. It is tonight." Marius turned then, finally, sweeping the room with the kind of gaze that made even immortals straighten. "Leave us." The court emptied with remarkable efficiency. Isadora waited until the great doors boomed shut before she allowed herself one slow, measured breath. Her heart was thundering. She was human enough to know that was a problem here where every creature in the room could hear it. Marius turned back to her, and something in his expression had shifted. The fury was still there, but behind it, barely visible, was something that looked almost like fear. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. "Every detail. Leave nothing king out," she told him. The ladder, the high shelf, the slight loss of balance, the hand reaching out for purchase and finding the armrest of a throne that had been sitting dormant in the corner of the hall, like a piece of furniture Everyone carefully avoided noticing. She told him about the pulse, the warmth, the color she could not name. She was precise and calm and thorough, because that was who Isadora Voss was, the kind of woman who kept her wits when the world was coming apart around her. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those silver eyes. "Sit down, Miss Voss. I prefer to stand when I think I might need to run." Something moved across his face that might have been the ghost of a smile on any other man. "You cannot outrun me." "I know, but the instinct is still there." She held his gaze. "What did I do? Lord Dragomir, what does it mean that the throne responded to me?" He moved to one of the tall windows that overlooked the city far below, because that was what Noctura was, truly. Not a castle in the countryside, but the 7th and 8th floors of a building in the centre of London that looked, from the outside, like an unremarkable corporate headquarters. The city hummed and glittered 40 feet below. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and looked out at it for a moment, as though weighing how much of the truth she could hold. "The Silence Throne," he said, "is the seat of sovereign authority in the vampire world. Not just Noctura, the entire world. It was carved from black stone, quarried in the Carpathians in the 12th century by the first-blooded, the eldest of our kind. It responds to one thing only, pure sovereign blood, the blood of the line from which all vampire aristocracy descends." He paused. "It has not pulsed since my father sat in it 4 centuries ago." "I am human," Isadora said. "Yes, I am the maid. I clean your halls and press your linens and ensure that the east wing candles are always replaced before they burn to nothing. Yes, then why did it respond to me?" He turned from the window. The candlelight made his white hair look like hammered silver, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, which was not very unguarded at all. But still, there were cracks in the composure. Small ones, but there. "That," he said, "is the question that is going to either save this court or destroy it." She had come to Noctura through a placement agency. That was the mundane truth of it. A specialized staffing firm that, it turned out, exclusively placed human staff in vampire households, a practice that existed in a legal grey area of the treaty that had formalized coexistence between humans and vampires in 2019. The Treaty of Veiled Accord, as it was known, had given vampires legal status and protected territories in exchange for a cessation of unreported predation and a framework for peaceful coexistence with human society. Most humans went about their daily lives knowing vampires existed in the abstract, seeing them occasionally in the news, the way you might see a news segment about any other powerful, unusual demographic. The reality of actually working for one was considerably more intense. Isadora had needed the work. She was 26, had a degree in art history, and had spent 2 years in a museum that had abruptly lost its funding. The pay for working in a vampire household was exceptional. The NDAs were comprehensive, and she had been desperate and practical enough to sign on. She had not expected Marius Dragomir. She had expected, if she was honest with herself, something like the vampires in older films, theatrical, cold, possibly cruel. She had not expected a man who kept a library with actual books organized by actual subject, who spoke 4 living languages and 6 dead ones, who reviewed the household accounts himself every Thursday morning with methodical precision, and who, on her 3rd day of employment, had quietly redirected 3 of his own court members who had been edging too close to her in a corridor, not with violence, but with a single look that had communicated something in the silent register of vampire hierarchy that had sent them backing away with lowered eyes. She had not expected to feel safe, but she had. Strangely, irrationally, despite everything she knew and everything she had signed, she had felt safe inside these walls, and she had slowly, carefully, dangerously begun to understand why the 3 months between her arrival and the night of the throne had not been uneventful. The Court of Noctura was a pressure cooker of ancient politics and simmering resentments. And Isadora, who had been invisible in her function but observant in her nature, had catalogued more than anyone realized. She had watched Kaelindra meet privately with a vampire named Severin Vale, whose family had held territory in Eastern Europe before the treaty, and who had never entirely accepted Marius's authority. She had noticed the pattern of absences among certain court members, the way particular doors were consistently locked on nights when she had heard movement inside them. She had, because she was Isadora Voss, and she could not help herself, kept a small journal in her room that was really more of a growing evidence ledger. She had brought her concerns to Marius 3 weeks in, walking into his study at 10 din the evening and placing her notebook on his desk with the quiet confidence of a woman who had decided the right thing to do was more important than the safe thing. He had stared at her for a long moment. "You have been running surveillance on my court," he said. "I have been doing my job and keeping my eyes open," she said. "There is a difference." He had read every page. He had asked precise, intelligent questions. He had not dismissed a single observation. And at the end of it, he had looked at her with those silver eyes and said, quietly and carefully, as though each word was a small commitment, "You are extraordinary, Miss Voss." She had told herself it meant nothing. She had believed it, mostly for another 2 weeks. The throne changed everything. In the days that followed, Marius kept her close, not imprisoned, not restricted, close. He assigned her duties that kept her in the main occupied wings of Noctura rather than the isolated service corridors. He appeared, with what she recognized as manufactured casualness, in whatever room she was working in, lingering to review documents or read. And she had enough experience with the way he moved through space to understand that he was not doing it for his own benefit. He was doing it because Kaelindra's reaction to the throne had told him something, and that something had shifted his assessment of the threat level around Isadora considerably upward. She confronted him about it on the 4th day. "You are guarding me," she said. She was in the library, rehelving books from a cart. He was in the armchair by the window, supposedly reviewing legal correspondence. "You have been within 30 feet of me for 4 days. I work in my library frequently. You work in your study. I have been employed here for 3 months. This is the first time I have seen you in the library when I am working in it." She put a book on the shelf with a decisive click and turned to face him. "What do you know that you are not telling me?" He put the correspondence down. "Kaelindra has called a closed session of the senior court for tonight," he said. "The agenda, which I was given this morning, lists 2 items. The first is a motion to formally challenge my authority as Lord of Noctura on the grounds of alleged mismanagement of a sovereign artifact. The second is a motion to have you remanded to the custody of the tribunal for investigation." He watched her process this. The tribunal is the judicial body that governs disputes under blood law. It is not known for its mercy toward humans. Isadora absorbed this with the careful steadiness she applied to most things, then asked, "What are my options?" "The motion to challenge my authority requires a 2/3 majority of senior court. I do not believe Kaelindra currently has those numbers, but she is working toward them. The motion regarding you requires only a simple majority and is considerably more dangerous." He stood, setting aside the correspondence entirely, and crossed the library to where she stood, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her chin slightly to hold his gaze. "I am going to tell you something that cannot leave this room. Everything in this building is already confidential under 7 NDAs, she pointed out. And this is beyond NDAs. His voice was very quiet now. What happened with the throne is not just an anomaly. Isadora, the throne pulses for sovereign blood. Vampire sovereign blood. My scholars have been reviewing the ancient texts since that night, and they have found a reference. A single passage in a chronicle from the 13th century, describing a phenomenon called the veiled inheritance. She waited. The veiled inheritance, he said, describes a bloodline, a specific bloodline descended from a human woman who was the consort of the first blooded. She was never turned. She chose to remain human, but she carried in her blood a recessive trace of sovereign power that passed through generations of her entirely human descendants. The chronicle says that this power would remain dormant and invisible until the right moment, the right proximity, the right, he paused, alignment of circumstancer. You are telling me, Isadora said slowly, that I may be distantly descended from the consort of the vampire who created your entire aristocracy. I am telling you it is possible. That is insane. Yes, that is completely insane. Also, yes. And now there was something in his expression that was definitely not manufactured casualness, something warmer and more complicated that he seemed to realize he was showing and did not entirely move to conceal. But it is also the only explanation that is consistent with what happened, and with you, with me. You are not an ordinary person, Miss Voss. You have been inside this court for 3 months. You have navigated its politics with more intelligence than some vampires who have lived centuries. You feel things very clearly, and you act on them with a kind of moral precision that is. He stopped, chose words carefully. Uncommon. She looked at him for a long moment. The library was quiet around them, the city invisible beyond the blackout curtains that every vampire space maintained. The candles on the shelves burned low and gold. You are trying to protect me, she said. I am trying to understand what is happening so that I can protect you more effectively, he said. There is a distinction. What does Kalindra want? Isadora asked. Truly, not the political moves, not the motions and the tribunal references. What does she actually want? Marius was quiet for a moment. The throne, he said. Kalindra has wanted control of this court. For 200 years she has maneuvered and waited and never quite had the pieces in place. The moment you activated the throne, she saw an opportunity. If she can demonstrate that the throne responded to a human, she can argue that the throne's legitimacy is compromised, that sovereign authority in Noctura is therefore vacant, and that a new lord must be selected by senior court vote, which she has been quietly buying for decades. She wants to use me to unseat you. Yes, and if I am who the ancient texts suggest I might be, if the veiled inheritance is real, and I truly carry some trace of sovereign power, what does that mean for her plan? He met her eyes. It destroys it entirely. If the throne responded to you not because sovereign authority is compromised, but because you are a legitimate carrier of it, however diluted, however unexpected, then the throne was functioning exactly as it should. It was recognizing its own. He paused. It also means that you are, under ancient blood law, what our oldest codes would call a witnessed sovereign, a person of non-vampire blood who carries the inherited claim. The political implications are significant and deeply inconvenient for Kaelindra. Isadora set the book she had been holding back on the cart. She turned this over in her mind with the methodical thoroughness that was her nature, examining it from every angle, looking for the holes and the leverage points and the things that did not yet make sense. "Can you prove it?" she asked. "The veiled inheritance. Can it be verified?" "There is a test," he said carefully. "The ancients describe a ritual called the blood accord. It requires the potential veiled heir to place both hands on the throne and speak the founding words of the sovereignty. If the throne responds fully, if it rises, if it sings, if the full sovereign light activates, it is proof, undeniable, permanent proof, recorded in the stone itself. What are the risks?" He was quiet for a moment too long. "Marius." She used his name for the first time and felt the small electric shift in the air between them as she did. "What are the risks?" "If the claim is false," he said, "the throne will reject the accord, and the rejection is not gentle. It is designed to be lethal. The founding vampires built it that way to prevent fraudulent claims." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I will not allow that risk to be taken. That is not your decision. In this court, my word is law. I am not one of your subjects." They looked at each other. The candlelight shifted between them. He was close enough that she could see the exact, precise silver of his eyes, and she watched something move through them, protectiveness, and something rawer underneath it, something she was only beginning to put language to. "No," he said quietly. "You are not." The closed session that night was everything Marius had predicted and worse. Isadora was not present for it. He had asked her, explicitly, to remain in her room, and for once she had complied, not because she was told to, but because she understood the tactical value of not giving Kaelindra a visible target. She sat on her bed and read and listened to the building breathe around her. 3 hours into the session, she heard it, a sound from deep in the building, not quite a crack and not quite a roar, something between the two, the sound of something old and contained coming under serious pressure. She was on her feet and in the corridor before she had consciously decided to move. The main hall was chaos, not physical chaos. Vampires were too controlled for that, but the kind of chaos that lived in stillness and compressed fury. The senior cohort was arrayed around the room in hard-edged groups, fault lines visible between them. Marius stood at the center with the absolute stillness of a man who had made peace with whatever was about to happen. Kaelindra was on his left, and beside her stood Severin Vale, whose handsome face held the particular satisfaction of someone watching a long game arrive at checkmate, and the thuf was glowing, not the amber and white of Isadora's touch. This was red, deep, arterial, furious red, pulsing from within the black stone like a heartbeat, and Isadora understood in one crystalline second exactly what she was looking at. Severin had touched it, or tried to. He had invoked some version of the blood accord for himself, claiming the vacant sovereignty that Kaelindra's motion had manufactured, and the throne was not singing. The throne was rejecting him violently and completely, and the red light was the color of that rejection. "Get away from it," Marius said, his voice cutting through the room with authority that needed no amplification. Severin's hand was still on the armrest. His face was white, whiter than the bloodless pallor of his natural state, and his expression was the expression of a man who had miscalculated badly, and was now experiencing the consequences in real time. The rejection light was climbing his arm, veins of red moving under his skin. "Kaelindra," Marius said very quietly, very precisely, "if you do not stop this right now, your ally will be dead before dawn." He was simply demonstrating his claim, Kaelindra said, but her voice had lost some of its practiced certainty. She was watching the red climbing Severin's forearm with an expression that suggested even she had not anticipated this outcome. Isadora crossed the hall. She did not plan it. She did not deliberate. She simply saw what needed to be done with the same clarity she brought to everything, and she did it. She walked straight to the throne, placed both hands over Severin's hand, and pushed. The amber light came back, warm and immediate, flooding up through her palms, and where the amber touched the red retreated, slowly, painfully, but retreated. Severin yanked his hand away and staggered backward. The red light died. The throne settled into a low, steady amber glow under Isadora's hands, and stayed there, quietly luminous, as though it had been waiting for her specifically. The room was absolutely silent. Severin was on his knees. He would live. The rejection had not run its full course. Marius was looking at Isadora with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and could not entirely name, though she had several words for it that she did not allow herself to complete. "Well," Kaelindra said, and her voice had changed entirely. The aristocratic control cracking down the middle to reveal something beneath it that was not confidence at all, but its precise opposite. "Well, that is—" "That," Marius said, stepping forward to stand beside Isadora, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, "is the veiled inheritance. And I believe you will find that blood law is now extremely clear on the matter." The aftermath of the throne room revelations broke Kaelindra's coalition in a single night. 3 of the 6 senior court members she had aligned to herself came to Marius, privately before morning, with apologies phrased in the elaborate, face-saving language of vampire aristocracy. Severin Vale, surviving and humiliated and quietly furious, departed London for his eastern territories within 2 days. The challenge motion was formally withdrawn. Isadora did not feel triumphant. She felt mostly exhausted and deeply uncertain. She found Marius in his study the morning after the session, before the rest of the court had stirred, while London outside the blackout windows was grey and beginning, and she knocked on the open door and came in and sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited, which was something she had started doing some time in the 2nd month and had never stopped. "I need to understand what comes next," she said. He looked up from the book he had opened, a chronicle whose language she could not read. He looked, she thought, very tired, in the way that immortal things did not usually look, not physically depleted, but worn in some older, deeper register. "There will be a formal verification," he said. "The full blood accord conducted before witnesses to officially establish the veiled inheritance claim. This is the step I was not willing to risk before." He paused. "After what happened last night, I believe the risk has changed. The throne's response to you has been witnessed by the entire senior court. A false claim at this point is almost impossible." "Almost." "Almost," he agreed. She looked at him across the desk and asked the question she had been carrying for days. What does a witnessed sovereign actually mean? In practical terms, what am I in the structure of your world? Marius was quiet for a moment, and in the quality of that quiet she heard the answer before he gave it. "Under the oldest blood law," he said carefully, "a veiled higher who passes the full blood accord is considered a sovereign-adjacent person, not a vampire, not a subject, but something that has not existed in our legal framework for over 1,000 years. He looked at her directly. The ancient code calls it a bonded light, a human-bearing sovereign inheritance who stands in a covenant relationship with the ruling lord of the court in which the throne recognized them. She processed this with the methodical calm she brought to everything. A covenant relationship, she repeated. It is not a requirement, he said quickly. Too quickly, she noted. The ancient codes describe it as a natural consequence, a recognition of aligned sovereignty, but the modern framework does not mandate it. Your status as veiled higher does not depend on any relationship with me. I want to be very clear about that. She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze with the composure that was his nature, but she had spent 3 months learning the small tells that lived underneath it, and she could see the ones that were present now. What would the covenant mean, she asked, if someone chose it? He stood and moved to the window, which was covered as always, and stood with his back to her for a moment before turning. It would mean that you are formally under my protection in a way that no blood law in the world could override. It would mean a permanent bond of acknowledged sovereignty between us. It would mean, he paused, and something in his voice had shifted into a lower, quieter register that she felt in her sternum, that I would spend whatever remains of my considerable lifespan ensuring that nothing in any world, human or vampire, could ever touch you. The room was very still. You are describing something that sounds significant to you, she said softly. Yes, in a way that goes beyond politics. He came back to the desk and sat on the edge of it, closer to her now, and looked at her with silver eyes that were entirely unguarded, for the first time in the 3 months she had known him. Isadora. The use of her name, her first name, without title, was itself a kind of declaration. I have spent 4 centuries in this court. I have managed alliances and broken curses and buried people I cared about and watched the world transform around me 3 times over. I do not experience things lightly. I do not speak of them easily, and I am very aware of the difference between what is professionally appropriate and what is true. Her heart was beating fast. She was aware of it the way she imagined he was aware of it, which was a strange thought. What is true? She asked. The night you walked into my study with your notebook full of court intelligence and put it on my desk with that absolute composure, he said. I knew you were unlike anyone I had encountered in a very long time, possibly ever. He did not look away. Every day since has confirmed it, the way you think, the way you hold yourself, the way you walked into that hall last night and put your hands on a throne that could have killed you without hesitating. Because someone needed help. His voice had gone very quiet. I have been trying, with moderate success, not to feel what I feel about you, because you are human and employed in my service, and because it would be a profound misuse of the power I hold in this context. But I will not lie to you. I will not manage you into a comfortable half-truth. You asked what is true, and this is true. Isadora stood up. She was not entirely sure when she had decided to do this, but she had decided, and she had learned a long time ago to trust the decisions that came from that deep, certain place in herself. She walked around the desk to where he was, and she stopped in front of him, and she looked up at him, and she said, I stopped being able to pretend this was just a job approximately 6 weeks ago. Something broke open in his expression, something that had been held under immense, centuries-long pressure. He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to move away, and cupped her face in his hands, and she let him, and she put her hands over his and held them there, and neither of them moved for a long moment, just breathing the same still air, the city invisible and irrelevant outside the windows. You are the most recklessly brave person I have ever met, he said. You are the most complicated man I have ever met, she said, and I mean that as a compliment. He leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers, and they stayed there, the Lord of Noctura and the human maid, who was apparently also something ancient and sovereign and impossible, and Isadora felt the rightness of it in the same deep place where she had felt the throne pulse. It was not simple. None of it was simple. She understood that. She was human, fully and completely, and he was not, and the world they lived in was a treaty world where those differences had legal dimensions and social dimensions and logistical dimensions that would need to be navigated carefully. But she had never been frightened of complexity, and she had never been frightened of him, and standing in his study, with his hands warm against her face, she understood that this was a beginning rather than a conclusion, and that beginnings required courage rather than certainty. She kissed him first, he kissed her second and third, and for considerably longer. The formal blood accord was conducted 9 days later in the presence of 12 senior court witnesses, 4 of them from outside Noctura, representatives from the other great vampire courts of Europe, who had been quietly summoned by the rapid spread of news through the vampire world's own communication channels. The veiled inheritance was not merely a Noctura affair, it turned out. It was an event that resonated through the entire ancient structure of vampire sovereignty, and the other courts wanted to see it with their own eyes. Isadora stood before the throne in a room crowded with immortal witnesses and felt, for the first time in her life, the specific particular terror of a moment whose outcome could not be controlled. She had prepared herself for every contingency she could think of. She had reviewed the ancient text with Marius's chief scholar, a vampire named Irena, whose age was genuinely unclear even to herself, who had walked Isadora through every detail of the ritual, with the meticulous patience of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment for a very long time. She had asked every question she could think of, but in the end, she stood alone before the throne. Marius stood to her right, close enough to be a presence, not close enough to interfere. They had discussed this. He had wanted to stand closer. She had said no, because this needed to be her act, her claim, her proof, and she needed the room to know it. She placed both hands on the armrests. The throne pulsed immediately, amber and white, and that unnamed color, and she felt it move through her the way it had the first time, but deeper now, fuller, as though whatever connection existed between her blood and this stone had been waiting for her to come back. She heard the ancient words rising in her mind, not in any language she had ever learned, but in something older, something that felt less like language and more like understanding expressed as sound. And she spoke, then the throne rose, not metaphorically. The stone itself lifted, slightly, an inch perhaps 2, in a way that the laws of physics absolutely insisted it could not, and it sang, a sound that was not audible in the human register, but that the vampires in the room heard with expressions ranging from awe to disbelief, to something that looked very much like reverence. Isadora felt it in her bones, harmonic and ancient and entirely sure of itself. The sovereign light, full, complete, white as starlight, flooded the room. Rena made a sound that, from a vampire whose composure had survived 8 centuries, was essentially a gasp. The light faded after several seconds. The throne settled back into its ancient position, still warm and amber glowing, and Isadora straightened and turned to face the room. Every vampire in it, including the foreign court representatives, was watching her with the particular focused stillness of beings who understood that they had just witnessed something that would be recorded in their histories. Marius was looking at her with an expression of absolute, unguarded pride. She met his eyes across the room and allowed herself, briefly, to feel what she felt, which was enormous and warm and rather terrifying and deeply, completely right. The verification being complete, the political consequences unfolded quickly. Kaelindra, stripped of her coalition and faced with the reality of a witnessed, proven, veiled hire, chose the option available to defeated court nobility under blood law, formal submission and reintegration at a reduced rank. She did it with her characteristic composure, which Isadora found she respected even while finding the woman genuinely dangerous, and Marius accepted it with the same composure, because the ancient codes were clear that mercy in victory was a mark of sovereign strength. The foreign court representatives negotiated the political implications over 3 days of closed meetings, and Isadora was included in these meetings, which had surprised several of the visiting vampires considerably and would have surprised her 3 months ago, but no longer surprised her at all. Marius included her, not as a courtesy, but as a matter of course, pulling out her chair, deferring to her analysis on several points when her understanding of the human context of the treaty was sharper than his, and generally treating her opinion as a natural and expected component of any room she occupied. The representative from the court of Velharith, an ancient vampire named Isolde, whose white hair was braided with gold wire and whose age put her at somewhere near 1,000 years, watched this with a particular expression for 2 days before cornering Isadora in the corridor outside the meeting room and asking, with the directness of someone too old to bother with indirection, "How long have you been together?" "That is," Isadora said carefully, "a complicated question given the timeline." Isolde smiled, which was rare and startling and made her look almost young. "He has been in love with you for considerably longer than you have known it," she said. "I knew Marius's father. I have known Marius since he was turned. I have watched him manage this court with brilliance and absolute loneliness for 400 years. She paused. "Do not make him wait unnecessarily long. Immortals have patience, but hearts are impatient things, regardless of how many centuries they carry." Isadora thought about this. That evening, after the foreign representatives had retired and the political conversations had finally paused. For the night, she went to find Marius. He was in the library, as he often was in the late hours, at the table near the window, with a glass of something deeply red that she had learned not to examine too closely, reading a history of the first-blooded that predated print by several centuries. She sat across from him and said, "Isolde says you have been in love with me for longer than I have known it." He set down his glass with the precision of a man controlling a reaction. "Isolde has known me for a very long time and has an imprecise relationship with confidentiality." "Is she wrong?" He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "No." She folded her hands on the table and looked back at him with the clear, direct gaze that she knew by now he found both admirable and slightly unnerving. "I want to talk about what comes next," she said. "Not the politics, not the blood law implications, you and I, the actual shape of what this is and where it goes." He closed the book. He gave her his full attention, which was a thing of considerable weight when it was fully deployed. "I am human," she said. "I will age. I will eventually die in the way that humans die, regardless of whatever sovereign inheritance lives in my blood. I want us to be honest about that from the beginning, because it will matter." "I know," he said quietly. "And you are 4 centuries old and will presumably continue for another 4 centuries after I am gone. And that is a grief I am willing to have eventually, because the alternative is not having this at all, and I have thought about it carefully, and the alternative is not acceptable to me." She paused. "I want you to know that I am going in with open eyes. I am not asking you to pretend that the difference between us is not real. I am asking you to be with me in it." Marius was very still for a moment, and then he stood and came around the table and crouched in front of her chair so that his eyes were level with hers, and took both her hands in both of his, which were cool and strong and very careful. "There is something I have not told you," he said, "because I did not want it to influence your choices, and because the timing was never right, and because I was, if I am being honest, afraid of how it would sound." She waited. "The veiled inheritance in its full expression, the complete blood accord, which you performed, does not function identically in every case. In some historical instances, the oldest texts describe it changing over time, deepening, the sovereign inheritance in veiled heirs who sustain the bond with the throne, who remain in the court, who are formally connected to the ruling lord." He paused. "It can, in some cases, begin to activate more fully. The texts describe veiled heirs who lived far beyond human norms, not immortal, not vampire, but long, considerably longer than the expected human lifespan." She stared at him. "How long?" she asked. "The texts are imprecise. Centuries in some cases. It is not guaranteed. It depends on factors that are not entirely understood. It may not happen at all." He looked at her with silver eyes that were entirely stripped of every layer of composure and protection and centuries of careful management, down to something raw and honest and very old. "I am telling you this not because I want you to stay because of it, but because you asked for honesty and you deserve it. Whatever happens, I want you here, for however long here is possible." Isadora looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You absolute wreck of a man, did you think that would be bad news?" Something in his face shifted, cracked entirely, and he laughed. A real laugh startled out of him, unlike anything she had heard from him before. Warmer and younger and more open than the composed, controlled lord she had been watching for 3 months. She slid out of the chair and onto her knees in front of him, and put her arms around him and held on. And he held her back with the carefully restrained strength that was always there beneath the composure, arms around her like something that had been waiting to be allowed to do exactly this for a very long time. "I am staying," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said into her hair. "I know." The formal covenant was conducted on a Wednesday evening in November, 3 weeks after the blood accord, because the political timeline required the Noctura court to host a formal witness ceremony before the visiting representatives from Velhareth and the other courts returned to their own territories. Isadora had expected something elaborate and ancient and intimidating. She got all of those things, but she also got Marius, who stood across from her at the sovereign throne with his hands around hers and spoke the binding words in a voice that was completely steady and completely sure, and who looked at her through the entire ceremony with the expression of a man who had spent 400 years waiting for something to be worth this much. The throne pulsed amber through the whole of it, gentle and constant. Isolde, seated in the front row, was observed to smile twice. There was a perception after the ceremony that Isadora would have called a party if the attendees had not been predominantly immortal and the refreshments had not required a separate service entirely for the human members of the household staff. She drifted through it with the easy confidence of a woman who had, over 3 months, learned exactly how to move in vampire court social spaces. which turned out to be not so different from other social spaces that operated on hierarchy and ancient grievance and very good tailoring. She spoke with Isolde at length about the history of the veiled inheritance, of which Isolde had genuine first-hand knowledge that predated written records. She had a brief, carefully civil exchange with Calindra, who was present at her reduced rank with the particular composure of someone who had decided that composure was the only thing she had left and was committed to wearing it well. She accepted congratulations from the senior court members, whose names she now knew, and whose particular personalities and political alignments she had long since mapped. And periodically, across the room, she found Marius. Every time she found him, he was already looking at her. It was, she thought, going to be like that. The kind of thing where you look up and there they are, not because they have been watching obsessively, but because you are simply always in each other's awareness. A kind of attention that does not require maintenance because it is built into the structure of who you both are. She liked it very much. Near midnight, when the reception had begun to thin, the foreign representatives making formal departures, the senior court drifting toward their own quarters, the staff moving through quietly with the practiced invisibility that Isadora still felt she understood from the inside, Marius found her by the great windows, where she had retreated for a moment of quiet, and stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, and they looked out at the city together, London spread below them in all its enormous, glittering, ordinary life, millions of people going about a Wednesday night, with no particular awareness that somewhere above them an ancient, vampiric court had just formalized a bond between its lord and a human woman who had activated a sovereign artifact with a feather duster in her hand. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking that 3 months ago I was unemployed and worried about my rent," she said. "And now I am apparently a veiled hire with a sovereign covenant and a vampire lord who looks at me the way you look at me, and the city looks exactly the same as it did then. Does that bother you?" "No." She turned to look at him. "It makes me think about how much can change without the world noticing, how the important things happen in rooms most people will never see." She paused. "It makes me glad I said yes to the job." He turned to face her fully, one hand coming up to brush her jaw, and he smiled. The real one, the one she had started to recognize. Less composed than his public face, and a great deal more beautiful. "You put a notebook full of court intelligence on my desk," he said, "on your 3rd week. You had a conspiracy operating in your East Wing. You could have reported it to the placement agency and asked for reassignment. That was never going to happen." "No," he agreed, "it was not." He leaned down and kissed her, unhurried and certain, and London continued below them, and the throne in the great hall pulsed gently in the dark of its own accord, amber light, steady and low like a kept promise. The weeks that followed were, by the standards of everything that had preceded them, quiet. Isadora settled into a new role that had no official title and no precedent in the court's organizational structure, which Irena was apparently writing up as a formal amendment to the Noctura governance charter, with the methodical satisfaction of a scholar who loves nothing more than creating a well-documented first. She continued to maintain some of her previous duties because she wanted to, not because she was required to. She found genuine satisfaction in the physical engagement of work, in the concrete and manageable nature of tasks that had clear beginnings and ends, in contrast to the sprawling complexity of vampire court politics. Marius found this endearing in a way he expressed through extremely restrained but visible approval. She also began, with Irena's help, to study the history of the vampire world, the blood laws in their full complexity, the political structure of the courts across Europe and beyond, the specific history of the veiled inheritance that was, apparently, her own inheritance. She was a quick study, and she was thorough, and Irena, who had been waiting 8 centuries for a student worthy of the material, was clearly in scholarly heaven. She and Marius fell into a rhythm that suited them both. He was a morning person in the vampire sense, which meant late nights, and she adjusted her schedule easily. They read together in the library, which remained the room she thought of most naturally as theirs. He told her about the centuries, carefully and selectively, choosing the things that would mean something to her, rather than overwhelming her with the full immensity of 400 years. She told him about her life before Noctura, her childhood, her parents, her years in school and at the museum, the particular feeling of loving history when you were not sure you were making any of your own. "You are making it now," he said once, on a late night in December when the city was quiet outside and the library was warm. "I know," she said. "It is very strange and very good." There was a moment in January, several months into the new shape of her life, that she would later think of as the last real test of the foundation they were building. A representative arrived from a court in Eastern Europe, a court called Moraveth, whose lord was someone named Drevkan, ancient and coldly powerful, who had heard about the veiled inheritance, and whose arrival came with an undercurrent of purpose that Isadora caught immediately, and Marius had already identified. Drevkan's purpose, it emerged in a carefully managed formal meeting, was a proposal. Moraveth's court held several ancient artifacts that predated even the Silence Throne, items with powers that the Noctura chronicles only referenced obliquely and with considerable caution. Drevkan wanted access to Noctura's sovereign throne for academic study. In exchange, he was offering something he characterized as a gift of considerable political value, a formal alliance that would significantly expand Noctura's standing among the Eastern courts. The offer was, in political terms, significant. Marius was polite and attentive throughout the formal meeting, and afterward, alone with Isadora, he was uncharacteristically quiet. She waited until he was ready. "He did not come here to study the throne," Marius said. Eventually No agreed. "He came here to study me." "Yes, he wants to know if the veiled inheritance is transferable." She had been thinking about this since Drevkan's formal greeting, when the ancient vampire's eyes had moved over her with the particular assessing quality of someone looking at an object of research rather than a person. "He wants to know if there are others like me, if the bloodline can be traced, if there are other veiled hires somewhere in the human population." "Yes." Marius looked at her. "The alliance offer is real. It is also leverage. He wants to establish a formal relationship with Noctura that would give Moraveth access to the scholarly research on the veiled inheritance, including access to you. And you are asking yourself whether the political value of the alliance justifies accepting terms that would give another court access to information about me that I am not comfortable with." "I am not asking myself that," he said with a quiet certainty. "I have already decided no alliance is worth that. The terms are not acceptable." "Good," she said, "because I was going to say the same thing, and I wanted to see if you got there first." He looked at her with the particular expression she had learned to translate as the thing he felt. When she confirmed something he had hoped to be true about her. "We are going to need to send Drevkan back to Moraveth. Without an agreement, and without insulting a court, we may need as an ally eventually." "I can do that," she said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. "I have spent 6 months studying vampire diplomatic protocol," she said, "and I have 3 months of notes on how this court operates. Let me handle the meeting tomorrow. Not alone, you should be present, but let me lead it." He considered her for a moment. Then he said, "All right." The meeting with Drevkin the following morning was one that Irena would later describe in her Governance Chronicle as a diplomatic masterwork. Isadora was composed and precise and entirely in command of the room, acknowledging the genuine value of the alliance offer while redirecting the conversation with intelligent, well-researched specificity away from the veiled inheritance entirely and toward 3 alternative areas of potential cooperation that she had identified in her overnight research as genuinely valuable to both courts. She was neither aggressive nor too accommodating, she was clear. Drevkin, who was not accustomed to being managed by a human woman in her mid-20s, was visibly recalibrating throughout the meeting. He accepted the alternative framework with the graceful pragmatism of someone who recognized quality when it was aimed at him. When he left 2 days later, there was the framework of a genuine alliance in place, one that involved no access to Isadora and no research on the veiled inheritance. And Drevkin's final comment before departure, directed to Marius with a gravity that made it genuine, was, "Your consort is formidable." Dragomir, the rumors did not exaggerate. Marius for once allowed himself visible satisfaction. "No," he said, "they did not spring. Arrived in London in the way it always does, gradually and then all at once. And Isadora noticed it from the windows she had started opening during the day hours when only the human staff were moving through the building, letting the light in, filling the rooms with something that the permanent dimness of a vampire court space tended to exclude. She did this carefully, with awareness of the spaces occupied at all hours. But she did it, and Marius, who had been told about it by the building's facilities coordinator with an air of uncertainty about whether he should report it, had simply said, "Let her." She found this particular fact deeply, unreasonably touching. He could not share the daylight with her. That was a real limitation, and she did not minimize it. The sun was genuinely dangerous to him, not in the dramatic combustion way of older myths, but in a serious and painful reality. Prolonged daylight exposure caused a kind of cellular distress that was not immediately lethal for a vampire of his age and power, but was acutely unpleasant and became dangerous over time. He was a creature of the evening and the night, and she was a creature of full-spectrum light, and they had both decided that this was a fact to be accommodated rather than mourned. She brought the daylight in when he was asleep. She described it to him sometimes in the evenings, what the light had done to the library today, how London had looked in the afternoon sun, the particular quality of March, light on the city. And he listened with a careful attention that told her what it meant to him to receive. The world through her, she gave it to him gladly. That was love, she had decided. Not the absence of difference, but the willingness to build something across it. There was a night in late April, one of those London nights that felt genuinely warm for the first time all year, when they were on the roof of the building, accessible to Marius after sunset, when the sky was dark and the city below was gold and infinite, and she was sitting on the low wall with her legs dangling, and he was standing beside her with the kind of ease she had watched unfold in him over months, the composure still there but lighter now, less armor than nature. "Tell me what you want," she said, not in the context of anything specific, just out into the warm April night. because she found she wanted to know. He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which she appreciated. "I want this," he said. "Whatever this is, all of it. The politics and the history and the complications, and you reading in my library and putting your notebook on my desk and activating my ancient throne with a feather duster." He paused. "I want you to still be here in 50 years, 100, however long the veiled inheritance gives us. I want to build something together that is ours. Not just the court, not just the covenant, but a life that actually belongs to us." She looked at him with the city behind her and thought that this was the exact shape of everything she wanted too. "Then that is what we will do," she said. He sat beside her on the wall, which was something she had not expected him to do. Marius Dragomir perching on a roof wall like a person, and it made her laugh, and her laughter made him smile with the open smile, and they sat there together, in the warm April air with London spread below them in all its oblivious living glory. The months that followed were the kind that make themselves into the texture of a life, rather than a series of events. Isadora formalized her role in Noctura as the court's human diplomatic liaison, a title that Irena wrote into the governance charter with visible relish. She worked with the treaty authority to establish some precedents around veiled higher status in human vampire law, which was legally uncharted territory, and required a considerable amount of patient correspondence with people on both sides of the divide who were alternately fascinated and alarmed. She was good at it. She was good at standing in the space between two worlds and being legible to both of them. Marius watched her do this with the consistent, steady pride of a man who had known from the beginning what she was capable of and was satisfied to see the world beginning to catch up. They disagreed sometimes, as any two people of strong independent intelligence disagree, about approach, about strategy, occasionally about tone. These disagreements were, without exception, conducted with the directness and mutual respect of people who trusted each other too much to be anything less than honest, and they were invariably resolved through conversation that sharpened rather than diminished them both. Kaelindra, in her reduced rank, became, over time, something unexpected. Not an ally, not precisely, but a complicated asset. Her political intelligence was genuine, and her understanding of vampire court dynamics was encyclopedic, and Isadora, who believed in using all available information, began drawing on it carefully and with open eyes. Kaelindra's hostility had transformed into something that resembled cautious, reluctant respect, which was not warm but was useful, and was, under the circumstances, enough. Irena completed her history of the veiled inheritance, a comprehensive academic work that drew on sources from 12 different courts and covered 8 centuries of partial, fragmented evidence, and dedicated it, in the elaborate formal language of vampire academic tradition, to the first veiled heir to walk a living court in 1,000 years. Isadora read every word of it. Irena was visibly pleased. The throne continued to pulse amber when Isadora moved through the hall, not always visibly, not in a way that would have been noticeable to someone who was not paying attention. But Isadora paid attention, and she felt it, low and steady and certain, the way a fire feels even when you are not looking directly at it, on the anniversary of the night she had first touched it. A cold November evening, the city outside wearing its autumn self, she walked into the hall alone just before the court assembled for the evening. She stood in front of the throne for a moment, looking at it in the dim light, this ancient impossible black stone that had changed everything. She placed one hand on the armrest. The amber rose, warm and familiar, and she stood with it, moving through her palm, and up her arm, and into her chest, where it settled like something that had always been there, waiting. "You could have killed me," she told it. The amber pulsed once, gently. "Yes," she said, "I know, but you did not." She heard him behind her before he spoke. The particular quality of his presence, which she could feel now in a room before she saw him. As if whatever the throne had recognized in her blood had aligned itself to something that recognized him too. Talking to the furniture again, he said. "This furniture has opinions," she said, not turning yet. "You should know, it recognized you before you were born." He came to stand beside her, and she felt his hand come to rest against the small of her back, warm and certain, and she leaned into it slightly in the way she had started doing without thinking about it, the way you lean into something that is yours. "It recognized you too," he said quietly. She turned then and looked at him. "Marius Dragomir, Lord of Noctura, 400 years and counting. Silver-eyed and white-haired and entirely. Specifically the person who had remade her life by accident on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks into her employment by asking her to please explain what she meant by the notation in her notebook that read, 'Possible East Wings conspiracy, confirmed by Thursday.' 'I know,' she said. She kissed him in the throne room in the amber light with the court about to arrive, and the city humming below, and the old stone warm around them like a kept secret finally spoken. The throne held its light steady through all of it, ancient and sure and quietly, permanently satisfied. And Isadora Voss, who had come to clean the halls and had ended up holding the light, looked at the man she loved and knew, with the clear-eyed certainty that was her nature, that whatever came next, centuries or complications or the vast uncharted territory of a life built across 2 worlds, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had walked into this court with a feather duster and a notebook, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had never learned or trouble from a she could help solve. She had found, beyond all reasonable expectation, a home she had found, beyond all careful management, a love, and the throne of Noctura pulsed on beneath her hand, amber and eternal, recognizing in her blood the long line of a legacy she had never known she carried, into a future she was only just beginning to imagine, in a world that was larger and stranger and more extraordinary than anything she had ever dared to hope for. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.